Welcome to the Basic Training Podcast. This is a weekly live recording of a course led by Dr. Robert Forney to several men at Trinity Presbyterian Church in Spartanburg, South Carolina. The main topic of this course is how to be a man of God in today's society.
I'm often asked how difficult it is for me to talk about sex in an explicit way, something that I've been asked to do in church on more than one occasion, and it is very difficult. We all have a natural shyness when it comes to speaking about this, even with those that we love. I too have that shyness, but I will tell you that over my lifetime, my knowledge of others, I do know that many people are suffering in marriage because of difficulties in sexual intimacy between husband and wife. And I also know that very few who prepare people for marriage, pastors or other trusted friends or fathers, they're also shy and say very little about this relationship. My own pastor, at my urging, finally told me shortly before we were to leave on our honeymoon. He took me aside and said, "Be gentle," and that's about the sum of my preparation sexually. I have been on the faculty of a medical school. I do have some medical information about this that's readily available, actually, if you want to read books or go on the internet. But I think my medical background combined with my love of the Lord and study of Scripture puts me in a unique maybe place. Maybe unique's too strong, but in a place where I can explain, or will try to explain things in a way that maybe is more understandable or meaningful. I pray that that's the case for all of you who are listening to me. I want to start with a warning. This is adult content. I'm going to be speaking about physical intimacy, meaning sex in marriage, and I'm going to do that explicitly. The material is biblically based, but it's also anatomically and physiologically explicit. Abstinence before marriage, as we call one kind of purity, I'll briefly mention, but it's not the subject. This is not about encouraging young people to be abstinent, although fathers need to be doing this. Sexual perversion is a sin, but I'm also not going to address that. That's not the topic of this particular material. So I want to start talking about sexual desire. This is very important because sexual desire very often it becomes temptation to sin when that desire is not between a man and a woman in a marriage. And I want to use as the background for this the Song of Songs. Now, I'm not going to talk much about Song of Songs, but we do know explicitly what God thinks about sex, because Song of Songs in the Old Testament is about a marriage, including the physical relationship. And in the Hebrew, when we hear Song of Songs, that's like saying Holy of Holies, and it's a way of intensifying. We have good, better, best. So the superlative best is accomplished by this repetition. Holy of Holies means the most holy. Song of Songs means the best song, and that best song is the physical love between a husband and a wife. And so this song begins with these words, and the bride is speaking. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is more delightful than wine. Pleasing is the fragrance of your perfumes. Your name is like perfume poured out. No wonder the maidens love you. Take me away with you. Let us hurry. Let the king bring me into his chambers. That's Song chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. So the bride has a strong desire for private and intimate affection from her husband. This desire just doesn't magically appear, but rather it's something that is cultivated. It is my conviction that it is a husband's leadership that will lead his bride into this strong desire. Now, this desire is not sex itself, but it is an important preamble or beginning to it. Notice that this desire that she's expressing is very sensual, and it's more than just touch. It's very interesting that both taste, she says, your love is more delightful than wine. So there's a taste element to it, and also smell. She says, pleasing is the fragrance of your perfume. So one of the things that I'm going to be talking about is that sex, as God designed it, is to be all-encompassing, encompassing all five of our senses. Later in the first chapter, the groom speaks, and I want you to notice the difference between his desire and her desire. Her desire is very sensual. It's very based on her senses. And a husband should be attentive to the senses of his bride and should be loving her in all five senses. Listen to the groom. This is his opening statement in the book. Starts at verse 9. I liken you, my darling, to a mare harnessed to one of the chariots of Pharaoh. Your cheeks are beautiful with earrings, your neck with strings of jewels. We will make you earrings of gold and studded with silver. That's Song chapter 1, verses 9 through 11. Notice the difference between the bride's statement and his statement. They are both full of desire, sexual desire. When she is speaking, she is thinking about him making love to her. Let him kiss me with the kisses of her mouth. When he is thinking, what is he thinking? He's thinking about what he sees. His desire is stimulated visually. Now, our male desire can be stimulated through touch and through other things, but we are principally and especially visual creatures. So he sees her as a mare harnessed to one of the chariots of Pharaoh. So imagine the groom speaking, the king, is in a chariot and he's looking at the mare that is harnessed to the chariot. What does he see? He sees the bum. He sees the rear end. He sees the butt, if you will, of the horse. This we know, a woman's rear end is very attractive to a man. Other parts of her body are as well, but including her rear end. And so when he's thinking about her, or when he's speaking to her, and in his mind he's thinking about her physical appearance in a sexual way. He says, then he moves from her butt to her cheeks, to her face. Your cheeks are beautiful, again, a visual thing, your neck with a string of pearls. And then he wants to make adornments for her face, for her neck. So his sexual desire is visual in this case. Hers is more of the other senses. It's very interesting, the definition of sexual desire. It is defined as a motivational state and an interest in sexual objects or activities, or as a wish or drive to seek out sexual objects or to engage in sexual activities. Now, this is a secular definition of sexual desire. So let's think for a minute about how sexual desire is aroused, first in men and then in women. Now, I suppose you don't need me, you men, to tell you how your sexual desire is aroused. So you may disagree, you may want to add or subtract from this, but it's my opinion, as I've already stated, that visual cues are very important. One of the things that's difficult in marriage is that I believe that women are shy about their bodies, and I believe that many men go into marriage believing that now they're going to see their wife, whom they love, sexually, that she will not be shy about letting him see her body. Very often at bridal parties, there are lingerie gifts given to the prospective bride, and there's very often teasing. I've never been to one of these, but I'm told that that sort of thing occurs. The fact of the matter is that the lingerie very often doesn't survive far beyond the honeymoon. And I think this is because of a woman's natural shyness. But it still doesn't, it's not altered that this visual cues. I think temptations to adultery very often occur because other women who may be wanting to tempt us will be dressing more provocatively than maybe our own wives dress. And we have to be very careful about this. Okay, a second way that I believe we as men are aroused is also by touch, by caressing what are called erogenous areas. An erogenous area on the body is simply an area that, when touched in a certain way, will lead to a increase of sexual desire. Not all areas of our bodies are erogenous. They're not all, they don't all do this. But there are certain areas that are especially so. Kissing, more about this later, but kissing the mouth, both the lips and the inside of the mouth, would be one of these areas. The ears and around the ears. Even men's nipples, just like their wives, are erogenous in this way. Also the thighs, and obviously the genitals on both men and women. Another thing that I think we need to comment about is that a wife's authentic sexual responses are turn-ons. Now this, when we speak of desire before sex, maybe long before, well then we're not going to see our wives responding sexually. But during sexual intercourse, it is quite arousing to a man to see, hear, feel their wives responding with sexual pleasure. Now, I'm given to understand that there are many women who are frustrated, who have been married, whose husbands have made love to them on numerous occasions, who themselves have never experienced a sexual orgasm. And so if this is the case, well then these men have never seen their wives responding, and therefore they don't know what they're missing from a very selfish standpoint. From a leadership standpoint, it's not very loving, because pleasure, and I think Song of Songs demonstrates this, and the epistles that we've gone over in previous podcasts indicate that God does design this in a way for both of us to have pleasure, And it's this pleasure in each other that is part of the intimacy that we share and is an important part of sexual intercourse. Another thing that I think is arousing to men, and I think to some women, but I think especially to men, is novel sexual scenarios or variety. The thought of having sexual intimacy in a new location or in a new way, I think is a turn-on to many, if not most men. There's a neuroscientist, a pair of neuroscientists that published in a scientific journal, a neuroscience actually, journal, and made this quote about men's sexual desire, just in general. Men's greater sex drive may be partially due to the fact that their sexual motivation pathways have more connections to the subcortical reward system than in women. Or, in short, men's brains are designed to objectify females. Now, these are secular neuroscientists, but the point of the matter is in the brain there is something within what we call the limbic system, a reward system. And so the main sex organ in both men and women is in fact the brain, and not the external genitalia. And these motivation pathways have more connections to this limbic system, to this reward system. Okay, a little bit about women. Arousal for women, this is explicit, arousal in women is not as apparent in men in that we get erections which are much more obvious to ourselves and to our wives. Now, women actually get erections as well, but the erect clitoris is not nearly as evident, at least to a man. So this is an important difference. Why do I say this? Well, I don't know always, but especially with modern clothing that tends to be quite tight, we don't wear robes anymore. That means that many women are aware when a man gets an erection. And as a man responding to the arousal of his wife or to her sexual response, so our responding, our getting an erection, can be, depending upon our relationship with our wife, either off-putting, for example, if they're mad at us, or can be something that would be contributing to their desire. More importantly, though, is the stimulation of the woman's feelings. Importantly, her feeling desired. Now, this is where the knowing that we are getting an erection, if she's happy with us, can make contribute greatly to her self-esteem, because very often women are very critical of their own bodies and their own shape, and they don't believe that we would desire them if they don't look like they did when they were 16. Maybe even at 16 they didn't like the way their bodies looked, or believed that a man could find them attractive. But her feelings go beyond just feeling desire. Coupled with that is her feelings, we might say sexy. That might be a vulgar way to put it. But another very important feeling is her feeling secure. Part of that security is knowing that we will never leave her. It's feeling safe, knowing that that she doesn't have to worry that we're going to snap at her, that we're going to hurt her, that we're going to neglect her, that we're going to speak ill of her. This is all part of this feeling safe. And part of romancing our wives, as you understand we're talking about sexual desire here, includes the idea of her feeling safe. As we men, women also will respond to touch. This touch could be merely holding hands, which may or may not, depending upon how that's done, be sensual in nature. It may be more about warmth and intimacy than sensual, but it can be sensual. Similar areas: kissing, the ears, the backs of the thighs, the back of the knee, palms, when the fingers are touching the palms, the abdomen, the bottom of her feet, and then, of course, her breasts and her genitals. Women have a disconnect between subjective and genital responses to stimuli, and this makes them complicated. And it to us, when I said in an earlier podcast, a panel that had all kinds of switches and knobs and buttons and dials, is a woman, where we're simply toggle switch on and off. Women are more complicated than that. Here's another quote. Now, this is, again, neuroanatomy. And it's complicated if you're not familiar with these medical terms, but I'll try to explain. I'm quoting: during processing of sexual stimuli, brain areas associated with emotional inhibition are activated among women. Let me say that again. During processing of sexual stimuli, brain areas associated with emotional inhibition are activated among women. In other words, they have inhibitions, and these inhibitions are God-given. This is the way they are designed. Now, here's a technical term: the anterior cingulate cortex, or ACC. Anterior, that means in the front, cingulate cortex. The cortex is the main part of the brain. This is a part of that in the front. Is a region of the brain where subjective responses to sexual stimuli are processed. The ACC appears to influence subjective responses, but not genital responses. Women's ACC is most active during ovulation and when attracted to macho, high testosterone men. Just an aside, this means that a manly man, a man leading, is actually a sexual turn-on in the anterior cingulate cortex of women. This is a subjective response, not a genital response. This doesn't mean that their genitals are dilating. When a man gets an erection, it's because the penis is dilating. That means that the blood vessels are becoming engorged with blood. Well, this happens in a woman's genitals as well. The clitoris will become erect as it fills with and is engorged with blood. And the clitoris is very analogous to the male erection. And so what this is saying is, this neurology is saying is that the ACC is not connected to the genitals, so there's not going to be a genital response from this kind of subjective stimulation. But it's active during ovulation, and during ovulation is when women are most easily turned on. Now, men are turned on all the time. We're turned on all the time, but women not so much so, and we'll get to that later as I talk about the hormonal cycle and menstruation. The ACC is activated also when they're in conflict about something. Now, stay with me on this. Let me go back. During the processing of sexual stimuli, brain areas associated with emotional inhibition are activated among women. And so this ACC will inhibit a sexual response, and it's activated also in conflict. And so this is why it's very important for us to understand that a conflicted woman, a stressed woman, an angry woman is kind of the opposite as one who is apt to have sexual desire. That's why I say, ministering to her thoughts, enabling her to think and be relaxed and low stressed is more of a path that leads to sexual interest. With we men, this is not the case. We can be in a fight and still be sexually turned on. That's not women, and we need to understand that. Okay, both men and women were both stimulated through our imagination. And I might say we're both inhibited through our imagination. When we imagine bad things, for example, a jealous husband, or a wife who is suspicious, that can be a turnoff in both. But if we imagine, because our history it has been wonderful, because we look forward to an intimate encounter, knowing that it's going to be pleasurable and bonding, then this stimulation of the imagination, having things that remind us about things in the past that were wonderful, can be very much of a sexual stimulant. And both men and women, I emphasize visual in men, but as we talked about, when a woman sees a macho, high testosterone male, that can be a turn on. That this perception in women is also a stimulus. I think the visual part, while that perception may be more of our persona than looking at individual parts, although women are very much attracted to a tight male butt. So the rear end seems to be something that God intended to be involved with both men and women. There's a psychologist who has defined, and he's widely quoted, his name is Stephen Levine, the spectrum and intensity of desires. And to say that sexual desire is on this continuum, if we look, starting with a very negative, is aversion. And this aversion, we might call this a taboo. So sometimes when people get married, the husband may think of something normal that the wife has always thought of as being taboo, touching her in a certain way or in a certain place or whatever. Anyway, this aversion would be the definition Stephen Levine uses for the extreme negative. And then moving towards desire, there's disinclination. So a woman may be in aversion about certain things, or she may be disinclined. By the way, we may be as well. And moving towards further towards desire, the next would be indifference. So disinclination means no, I don't want to, no. Aversion means something much stronger than no. Indifference is more like, well, I don't care. Then that we move to interest. Well, yeah. And from there to need, and from need to passion. The reason I bring this up is I think a lot of husbands end up believing that indifference is something that their wife will always be, that their marriage is doomed to their being interested and their wives being indifferent or maybe even disinclined about sex. And this is most often to happen when men are married to women and don't approach her, as I've been trying to describe, meeting her needs, rather than thinking of her as a sexy example of a man. Women are not men. They are built differently, not just in their figures, but in their minds as well. Men, on average, we have significantly higher sex drives and desire for sex than women. That's on average. There are some hypo, that is low, sexual men, and there's some hypersexual men, and equally there are hyposexual women and hypersexual women. But on average, our sex drive and desire is stronger. On average, our sex drive remains stronger and more frequent and longer into the life cycle than our wives will. So that's why we see a lot of older men marrying younger women. And by older, I mean we see these people that are in their 60s and 70s who have a 20-year-old bride. Maybe it's the third or fourth marriage. And it's because their sex drive is still strong in that way. There's some older women that marry as well, but anyway, this is what research shows. Anyway, I don't have experience, obviously, in all these different types of people. Women do not experience sexual desire as often as men. When they do, the intensity of that experience is equal to that of men. So the issue is not that we have stronger desires than they do. It's that we will have those strong desires more frequently than they do, would be a better way to say it. 97% of women in one study reported having had sexual intercourse without sexual desire, while only 60% of men reported the same thing. So in other words, a lot of wives are having sex with their husbands because their husbands want it, but they don't necessarily have the same desire. And yet 60% of men reported doing the same thing, that engaging in sexual activity without having had a strong desire before. Women are more prone to change in their sexual desire through their phases of life than men. These phases include menstruation, while they're menstruating, while they're pregnant, during lactation, after menopause, as they get to be in their 50s, the age where menopause starts varies. Women are more easily irritated, they become less well lubricated, and mentally their hormones are not the same as they were when they were younger, and also when they're tired. Some men may be too tired for sex as well, anyone who's really tired, but fatigue probably takes less fatigue to have a negative effect on a woman's desire. So all we've been talking about so far is just desire. We're not even into the sex act itself, but I think this desire that precedes sex and understanding it, and especially for a man to lead in this, is important for us to think about. So there are different things that can affect our sexual desire. First thing is our relationship. Obviously, there's a difference between being married and single, but also is our relationship harmonious? Is it loving? Is it trusting? Is it compatible? Is it patient? This is probably more important to our wives than it is to us. Secondly, frequency. This is amazing to me. This is something I think everyone knows. I know everyone. Very few people actually know it, but I always thought everyone should have figured this out. In the when you have to urinate, you get an urgency to urinate, and the reason why that happens is because in the walls of the bladder, the urinary bladder, the sac, the urine forms in the kidney and it goes down through some tubes to the bladder, and it's stored there. And as that bladder becomes full, it stretches the walls. And as the walls stretch, there are nerves in there that are stretching. And as that stretch occurs, it sends a signal to the brain that we interpret as urgency. Now, it sort of comes and goes. The nerve will stretch, and if you have control, or if the exit is a long way away, you can sort of wait, and all of a sudden the urgency sort of diminishes a little bit. And this is understood by physiologists as an accommodation, that the nerve, having stretched, then accommodates to the new length. And this is the way these stretch receptors work. Well, there are similar receptors in the seminal vesicles. Seminal fluid, which is most of semen, semen is 70-75% made up of seminal fluid. Seminal semen fluid. And this fluid is made in the prostate, and it's viscous. It's sort of sticky. And as it's being produced all the time, it is stored in these vesicles, these seminal vesicles. And when these vesicles are full, there are these stretch receptors, and it makes that turns on our sexual desire. Full vesicles are associated with this increased sexual desire. Now, that doesn't mean that if we ejaculate once, that we don't have any sexual desire for a week. We all know that's not true. But abstinence, sexual abstinence for a week, is probably necessary to refill these vesicles. Now, there's lots of variables in this. Age. I'm an old guy, so this happens more slowly for me. I'm not, while my prostate is a little bit larger, it's not making this fluid the same way it did when I was young. Some of that has to do with testosterone. As an older guy, I don't have the same testosterone levels as a younger man will, and there's a testosterone hormonal effect in this. How hydrated you are, drinking lots of water, is associated with filling these vesicles more rapidly. But anyway, so this frequency with men has something to do with our sexual desire. The more frequent we have an ejaculation, that will then stem the tide on the desire. I think this is the basis why it's better to marry than to burn. That men are encouraged that marriage is a way to deal with their temptations. It's because in marriage, with sex and with frequent sex, that by at least in part emptying the seminal vesicles is a real help to a man in terms of getting his mind off of sex. Our general health. So for relationship status is the first thing that affects the sexual desire. Frequency for men is the second, not so much for women. Health in both men and women can create either hypo or hyper activity. Then there are other diseases, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, arthritis, men with an enlarged prostate. All of that will negatively affect sexual desire. And then next, medication. There are many drugs that will inhibit sexual desire. Cardiovascular meds, antihypertensives. I'm taking several antihypertensives. My family has a history of high blood pressure, and I have high blood pressure if I don't treat it. Some anticoagulants, cholesterol-lowering drugs, some psychiatric medication, especially SSRI, antidepressants, oral contraceptives in women. So there's lots of different drugs that will affect sexual desire, and talking to a physician and or pharmacist about this or examining through a legitimate information source online can help any who wonder about any drugs they may be taking. And lastly, in terms of things that influence this, is our hormones. Testosterone increases sexual desire in both men and women. Testosterone is made in the testes of men, in the balls, if you will, and it's made in the ovaries in women. Oxytocin in women, a female hormone, also increases sexual desire. In the handout, if you download it from YouTube, I have a diagram of a month, and this is a classic 28-day month for women. And if you look at that, when you see the handout, you'll see that estrogen fluctuates during the month up and down, but more or less is the same. Progesterone, on the other hand, begins to increase on day 14. Now, what's day 14? Day 14 is the time is measured from the beginning of menses. And menses is when bleeding starts, when the uterus is sloughing the lining. And so beginning on day 14, and it rises, becoming a peak on day 21 after about 3 weeks, and then it drops by day 28. Now, this menstrual cycle may be shorter or longer than 28 days, but classically it's taken as 4 weeks. There are differences in this, even between women, and even in the same woman, the menstrual cycle won't always be the same length of time, but generally the progesterone increasing means that the last 2 weeks of the month, with that month starting with the beginning of menses, are different than the first 2 weeks. So if we look at the difference between estrogen and progesterone, estrogen promotes the development of the eggs, and progesterone promotes the conditions for successful pregnancy within the uterus. Estrogen promotes active brain cells. Progesterone, on the other hand, inhibits brain cells. Estrogen produces more positive moods with an increase in alertness, an increase in the sensitivity of sight, sound, touch, an increase in feelings of self-esteem, enthusiasm, pleasure, and sexual arousal. In other words, estrogen is a turn-on. Progesterone, on the other hand, inhibits brain cells, creates more negative moods, decreases alertness, it's calming, tiring, anxiety and depression are more apt to occur during the second half of the month. Irritability increases and libido decreases. So a woman is not as receptive, the point is, depending upon her hormones, with the first 2 weeks after the beginning of menses being different than the more distant 2 weeks. In the male, the sex hormone is testosterone. Now, in the female, testosterone is a sexually stimulating thing as well. Testosterone is anabolic. That means it promotes proteins and the growth of muscles and cells. It promotes calcium. It promotes the growth and repair of not only muscle but also bone. It promotes active brain cells, positive moods, self-confidence, self-reliance, self-assurance, competitiveness, aggression, sexual arousal, all these things that we associate with a manly man. This is all a testosterone influences these things. Now, I want to tell you, I may have low T, low testosterone, but that doesn't mean, because I have low T, that I can't have any of these attributes. So when we say promote, I'm not saying they create. And I'm not saying that because progesterone is an inhibitor in women, more negative moods, it doesn't mean that a woman needs to succumb to that. We do have the Holy Spirit and control. But it is helpful if we're going to live with our wives with understanding, that we understand that while we may have more constant sexual desire, they don't necessarily, and there are all these different things that I've been talking about that will be influencing this. Okay, so the second part of this this podcast, I want to talk about sex itself. And I want to start by just defining a couple of terms that are used for intercourse. The first one is the term intercourse. This is actually, the root is a French term, entrecoeur, which the Latin is intercursus, and in the French, entrecoeur means an exchange, commerce, or communication. And the Latin form of it means a running between, or even an intervention. So this entrecoeur, or intercourse, sexual intercourse, is a sexual exchange or a sexual communication. Another word, a Latin word that is used for it, especially in medical circles, is called coitus. Very often, for example, coitus interruptus is what is defined by the sin of Onan. The man who has intercourse but then pulls out of the woman and ejaculates not inside her but on the ground. That's called interrupting coitus, or coitus interruptus. Coitus is Latin. It means a meeting together, especially a sexual union. And it comes from a participle coere, which means to come together or meet. So anyway, so we have this exchange or meeting. Okay, this may sound weird, but I've found this very helpful to me, and I hope it's a blessing to you as well. I know we've talked extensively about oneness, and I want to return to that just for a moment. The purpose for sexual intercourse, I maintain, is oneness. It is the intimacy, the bonding between a husband and his wife. It's for pleasure, procreation, protection from sin, and all of that occurs within this unity, this bonding that sexual intercourse, satisfying sexual intercourse between a husband and wife. God created us male and female, and what I want to tell you is that he didn't just make us male and female, but he made the entire universe male and female. So listen to this. The reason for marriage is that the husband and wife become one flesh. And this union is also between Christ and the church. So we've talked about this. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife. I don't know that I can pronounce it, but it's proskollethiatai, which means to be glued together. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be glued together with his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, a mega mysterion in the Greek. This is a mega mysterion, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you must also agapato, or agape, must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must probatai, must respect her husband. And so we are to agape our wives, and they are to respect us. And it turns out that that's what we want. Men want respect, and women want to be loved and cherished. Okay, so I said the entire cosmos, the entire creation is this. I want to talk about the periodic table. I wonder, this is in the handout, a chart of this, but I want you to think about the periodic table. Okay, if you know anything about this from your study of chemistry or elementary science, This table lists the elements that have been identified, and there's an order for these elements. If you look on the extreme left of that chart, they're called the alkali metals. And if you go to the extreme right of the chart, it is under the column labeled 8A. These are the inert gases. And if you go back one column from the extreme right, we get to 7A, and these are called the halogens. So I want to illustrate this by taking one of the alkali metals, that is one from the extreme left, that's sodium. And I want to contrast it with a halogen, chlorine. Now before I do that, at the top of the column, the alkali metals, is hydrogen. And at the top of the inert of column 8A is helium. What this means is, on this first row, that is the first row of the first column, hydrogen, that means that in the outer shell, there's a single electron. Now the problem is that these elements don't want to have a single electron in that outer shell. Some of the outer shells have more than 2 electrons. They may have 8. And so if a shell wants to have 8, chlorine, for example, has 7. That means it's -1. Hydrogen in the outer shell has 1, so you could say it's -1, or you could say it's +1. Let's take sodium. It's 2 rows down, but in its outer shell it has more shells, but in its outer shell it has an extra electron. So I tell you that on the left, these are male elements, and on the right, they're female elements. Chlorine needs another electron. And so when you combine sodium and chlorine, what happens is sodium shares its outer extra electron with chlorine. That makes sodium shell complete and chlorine shell complete. They combine and stick together, and we call it salt, table salt. So consider this. Sodium by itself is highly reactive. It reacts vigorously with oxygen and violently decomposes in water, forming sodium hydroxide, which is highly caustic and toxic. I happen to know about this because I'm a toxicologist. As a matter of fact, you can take sodium and expose it to air and it'll start burning. Chlorine, by itself, is also very reactive. In fact, explosive with hydrogen and oxygen. By the way, hydrogen and oxygen are found in water. It is used in low concentration, for example, in swimming pools. What? Because it kills things. It kills bugs. It's a disinfectant. By itself, it's deadly as a gas. So here we have sodium, which is highly caustic and toxic, chlorine, which is explosive and deadly, and you bring them together and we got salt. Isn't that amazing? This is godly sexual intercourse. You take these young men who are so violent and crazy in our country, and you marry them to some of these women who are equally going nuts, and you find within this union a stability that is part of what God intended. And so I encourage you that this instability in our relationship, is it possible that it could be defined by lack of oneness? That we don't have the God-sanctified unity within our marriage, that we're not combining, that we're not living with our wives with understanding as with a weaker vessel. Now, I want to say, we haven't talked about the extreme right. helium and the other inert gases, they have complete shells. So these inert gases, they don't interact with anything. They are complete in themselves. It's very interesting that God would have things that are complete within themselves within this as well. And I think this is a type of what Jesus said, that there are some for whom God's will is not to marry. And for all singles, whether this is God's will or not, by combining with Christ, Christ can provide this stability. But in marriage, which is God's will for most of us, this oneness stabilizes our volatility and makes us more useful. But whether we're single or married, in Christ, we are the salt of the world, providing we are united with him. So my next point after oneness is that sexual intercourse is biblically described and encouraged. And I want to go back to Song of Songs in the first chapter. And I'm going to read verses 12 down through 14. This is the bride speaking. While the king was at his table, my perfume spread its fragrance. My lover is to me a sacket of myrrh resting between my breasts. My lover is to me a cluster of henna blossoms from the vineyard of Ein-Gedi. Now, Ein-Gedi is a village along the Red Sea, and it has there's a cave, and David hid in this cave from Saul. And the cave actually has a freshwater stream flowing out of the cave into a little pool, and it's like an oasis. Ein-Gedi is like an oasis, and because of that, because it's very arid there, it became a place where they plant vineyards because it's this fresh water that forms there. Then this freshwater pool goes down into the Dead Sea. When I was in Israel, I spent a few days in Ein-Gedi, and I actually swam in both that freshwater pool and out in the Dead Sea. But what is this bride saying? Well, she's sitting there. She's, in her imagination, she's thinking about the king, and her perfume spread its fragrance. Now, this could be, Chanel number 5, but more likely than not, there is a fragrance that is produced when a woman is turned on. And the whole sense of this is that she's turned on, and her fragrance of her, the dilations and the lubrications that are going on is spreading out. And she talks about her lover, my lover, and she imagines him also as a sweet smell, a sacket of myrrh, resting between her breasts. So she imagines her lover lying between her breasts, and that this is a sweet aroma, her own aroma and her lover's aroma, and the closeness of between her breasts. And later in the second chapter, she says this, starting at verse 3. Like an apple tree among the trees of the forest is my lover among young men. I delight to sit in his shade, and his fruit is sweet to my taste. He has taken me to the banquet hall, and his banner over me is love. Strengthen me with raisins, refresh me with apples, for I am faint with love. His left arm is under my head, and his right arm embraces me. And so again, in this same attitude, she is sexually turned on, and she feels protected and provided for. She said, like an apple tree among the trees of the forest is my lover among young men. In other words, he's fruitful. I delight to sit in his shade, and his fruit is sweet to my taste. Continuing the thing of the apple tree. And what is his fruit? The fruit is, this is clearly a metaphor, a sexual metaphor for their lovemaking. So it's not only is the odor, but now the taste. He's taken me to the banquet hall. A banquet hall continues this tasting theme, this idea of eating, and his banner over me is love. Strengthen me with raisins, refresh me with apples, for I am faint with love. And so this fruit and this taste. His left arm is under my head, his right arm embraces me. So he provides her with raisins and apples, and she feels protected. And this is, when a woman is turned on, she needs to feel this protection and this provision. And anything in the relationship that's interfering with this will interfere with these feelings. Later in chapter 4, the groom speaks, and he says, "Your lips, my bride, drip honey. Honey and milk are under your tongue, and your fragrance and the fragrance of your garments is like the fragrance of Lebanon. A garden locked is my sister, my bride. A rock garden locked, a spring sealed up. Your shoots are an orchard of pomegranates, with choice fruits, henna and nard plants, nard and saffron, calamus and cinnamon, with all the trees of frankincense, myrrh and aloes, along with all the finest spices. You are a garden spring, a well of fresh water, and streams flowing from Lebanon." And then immediately the bride says, "Awaken, O north wind, and come, wind of the south. Make my garden breathe out fragrance. Let its spices be wafted abroad. May my beloved come into his garden and eat its choice fruits." So this is all metaphor, and it's involving odor, and repeating tasting. So sexual love includes tasting. She says, "His fruit was sweet to my taste." He says that her lips and mouth are sweet, i.e., open mouth, insert tongue, kissing. He also says that she is a garden and a well of fresh springs. That is, she's good for eating and drinking, and he wants to eat and drink. She welcomes him eating and drinking from her body. In fact, she says she wants the winds to bring him to her. "Awake, O north wind, and come, winds of the south. Make my garden breathe out fragrance. Let its spices be wafted abroad. May my beloved come into his garden." So it's like the winds are carrying her fragrance out, the fact that she's turned on, and are bringing her lover to him. She welcomes him eating and drinking from her body, wanting the winds to bring her, wanting him to eat of her choice fruit. She says that. "May my beloved come into his garden and eat its choice fruits." So this describes sex in a way that is very sensual, involving all the senses, and it's very visceral. Chapter 7 of Song. First, the groom, and this is they're in the very act of sex at this point, and he is speaking to her. And notice how he describes her body and how much of it. Starting in verse 1, chapter 7. "How beautiful your sandaled feet, O prince's daughter! Your graceful legs are like jewels, the work of a craftsman's hand." He's starting at her feet, and he's working up her body. "Your navel is a rounded goblet that never lacks for blended wine." Remember, we just read drinking wine from her. "Your waist is a mound of wheat encircled by lilies." The mound of wheat is undoubtedly her genital hair. "Your breasts are like two fawns, twins of a gazelle. Your neck is like an ivory tower. Your eyes are the pools of Heshbon by the gate of Bath Rabbim. Your nose is like a tower of Lebanon looking toward Damascus. Your head crowns you like Mount Carmel. Your hair is like royal tapestry. The king is held captive by its tresses. How beautiful you are, and how pleasing, O love, with your delights. Your stature is like that of the palm, and your breasts like the clusters of fruit. I said, I will climb the palm tree, I will take hold of its fruit. May your breasts be like the clusters of the vine, the fragrance of your breasts like apples, and your mouth like the best wine. Well, if we go back, we now see that her breasts are the apples that he was eating from her garden, and so forth. And so this is a very vivid description, although metaphorical, and it is not slam bam thank you ma'am. It is this is appealing to her mind and touching her entire body. The bride responds. This is the very next verse. The bride begins to speak. It goes down smoothly for my beloved, flowing gently through the lips of those who fall asleep. I am my beloved's, and his desire is for me. You see that? I am my beloved's, and his desire is for me. This desire that we have for our wives is one of the things that attaches them to us. And that's why his describing his desire for her makes her feel loved and makes her feel belonged. If you've listened to all of the podcasts, a few podcasts ago, I read a letter from Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones to his wife, Bethan. And he went on, I'm sure influenced by this very passage, describing his love for his wife. Come, this is the bride. Come, my beloved, let us go out into the country. Let us spend the night in the villages. Let us rise early and go to the vineyards. Let us see whether the vine has budded and its blossoms have opened, and whether the pomegranates have bloomed. There I will give you my love. So in other words, she's saying, let's go. But let's not go just anywhere. She wants to go a place, and the place she wants to go is beautiful. It's a garden, and it's implicitly private and secure, and that's where she wants. In other words, the setting of sex is important to her. The groom here is drawn to his bride's entire body, from her feet to the curve of her thighs, her navel, her breasts. The description is obviously of her naked body. Clothes would conceal what he is visually turned on by. It is obviously lawful for a godly husband to admire, kiss, taste, and caress his wife whenever he pleases. This is in Doug Wilson's book, Reforming Marriage. And she can't wait. She wants to go away to where they can be alone. There she will give him her love. She is as anxious for a 5 senses sexual encounter as he is. Okay, I want to refer to and read a little bit from Doug Wilson's book, Reforming Marriage. And he says that we are to beware the temptation to search for the perfect sexual experience. He says, he starts by quoting Paul from 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. For this is the will of God, your sanctification, that is, that you abstain from sexual immorality, that each of you know how to possess his own vessel in sanctification and honor, not in lustful passion, like the Gentiles who do not know God. So Doug Wilson says, Paul tells us we are to be different in how we love and not just who we love. So he says we're to be different than Gentiles in how we love and not just who we love. Non-Christians say we should all seek to have dynamic sex lives. The subtle distortion here can have one of two results. It either leads to a frenzied hump for the ultimate sexual experience, or it leads to the acquiescing frustration and dissatisfaction with normal sex. So 2 problems with dynamic pleasure as the norm. Okay, so what he's saying is that we are to beware this temptation to be looking for a perfect sexual experience. although he admits other places that I won't read, and I will agree from my experience, sometimes sex comes to near perfection, but it's not always so. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other things that are happening that are important when we have sexual union with our wives. Okay, what are these two problems of seeking this dynamic sexual pleasure as though it was the norm, that everybody has this dynamic sexual relationship? Doug Wilson, going back to Doug Wilson, he says two things. One, emotional inflation. This is his term. This is what he means. If everything is special, nothing is. If everything is dynamic, then dynamic becomes ordinary. They must continue to seek new thrills. The law of diminishing returns takes hold, and other novelties have to be tried simply to maintain the same level of excitement. This distortion can lead to various perversions. Okay, the second problem, this law of diminishing returns, is the first problem with emotional inflation. The second problem, he says, is our finitude. We are finite creatures, Doug says, and consequently our capacity for sexual pleasure has set limits. But lust, by its very nature, is incapable of recognizing such limits. Lust demands from a finite thing what only the infinite God can provide. This unwillingness to submit to the finitude of sexual pleasure has produced all manner of sexual perversions. Okay, so we're to beware of the temptation to search for the perfect sexual experience. That doesn't mean that we can't have an enjoyable sexual experience every time. It's just that to have a perfect sexual experience is not common. Okay, I want to finish. We still have a little bit, but with talking about the physiology of sexual response, and this is real important. You know, if you need to pause the podcast and take a break, you know, this is important enough that I want to have your full attention as you listen to it. Okay, the physiology of the sexual response. Now, depending upon who you read, there are either 4 phases or 3 phases, and I'll discuss each of them in this podcast. 4 phases. This comes from a classic work called Human Sexual Response that was published by Masters and Johnson in 1966. These 4 phases of the physical response are interlocking but separate and easily distinguishable. They are arousal, increasing excitement, orgasm, and resolution. So first of all, arousal. Now, we were talking about sexual desire. Sexual desire would come before arousal. The sexual desire is that which leads us to engage in the sexual activity to begin with. Arousal is the beginning of that sexual activity. Another term for what Masters and Johnson and those after them have referred to as arousal is foreplay. Foreplay is caressing, kissing, and other activities that begin the sexual excitement and begin to cause it to grow. During this phase, the husband should be gentle and patient, as my pastor had told me, pursuing his wife romantically, wooing and winning her. Wives feel desired when they are thus pursued. This includes relaxed kissing, soft and tender and loving words, gentle caressing, fondling are all appropriate in this phase. Fondling refers to, it's a term that refers to when the touch has to do with one of the sex organs. Okay, this arousal can go on for a long time. It may, by a long time, I mean it may be 10, 15 minutes. The next phase, Masters and Johnson called increasing excitement. Another term for it that has been used is plateau. After arousal, stroking of the entire body now moves to the breast, nipples, and genital area. So in other words, it's this increasing excitement now becomes much more genital focused rather than touching the other parts of the body. During this period, nipples become overly sensitive. Caressing should be spontaneous and creative, not mechanical and predictable. I'm going to repeat that. Caressing should be spontaneous and creative. That means there should be some variety, not mechanical and predictable. I am told in many who have less than ideal sex lives in marriage that sex has become mechanical and predictable, and this is not what it should be. Friends can get together and have fun, and yet they don't say the same things. They're not necessarily in the same place. They're not engaging in the same activities, and so neither should our sexual relationships be exactly the same thing each time. It should be this phase, like the first phase, should also be gentle and stimulate the imagination as well as the body. And what do I mean by stimulating the imagination? What I mean is, remember, the brain is the main sex organ, and so the idea is, what are the images, what are the thoughts that are going on in the brain? And hopefully those thoughts shouldn't be, ow, that hurts. This is not helping matters. During this phase, husbands need to exercise self-control, preventing premature ejaculation. Very often, the problem with the husband is, as I said earlier, with the seminal fluid, when there's an ejaculation, there can be a fairly rapid cooling down of the husband. And meanwhile, this can leave a wife frustrated because the wife is going to take much longer than the husband. The husband can go off like a rocket. The wife is a much slower boil. Wives need to let go to both respond and communicate her response with looks, touches, words, etc. As I said before, this is a turn-on to men. This also helps us and guides us in the way we are touching our wives. During this plateau, assuming the husband is able to maintain self-control, the erection can actually wax and wane, and this is not bad. Some husbands may get frustrated. What's going on? But what's going on is they're loving their wives and they're taking their time. It doesn't mean that their erection is gone to stay. What it means is that for these minutes, the attention is being given to the wife. A wife should not communicate discouragement, but should recognize that this is normal also during longer sessions. And so the husband should not be discouraged with the erection coming and going, and neither should the wife. This is normal. Also, the wife can help to stimulate her husband, but should also be aware, and I think men and women need to talk to each other, that the husband who doesn't want to have a premature ejaculation doesn't want too much stimulation. During this phase is when a woman will lubricate, which is very important. The vagina, the sleeve into which the erection goes through changes during this phase, not just lubrication. And when it enlarges, this changes the grip that the wife is able to have on her husband. So the vagina goes from a drier, smaller to a lubricated, larger, and then with continued stimulation, the lower vagina contracts again, and then the tight grip returns. Okay, phase 3. So arousal, then increasing excitement or plateau, and the third phase is the orgasm or climax itself. Orgasm is a word that comes from the Greek orge, which means excitement. So I want to talk about women first and then men. Orgasm in women has been described as a momentary feeling of suspension, followed by a sensation of warmth, plus a rhythmic contraction of the lower third of her vagina. There are 4 things that have been identified that increase the intensity of the wife's orgasm. The first is a strengthening the pubococcal muscle. This is sometimes called the PC muscle. And some people who treat sexual dysfunction will encourage a woman especially, but even a man, to strengthen this muscle by doing exercises. These exercises would be likened to stopping the flow of urine. If you can imagine, because this is the muscle that is used, if you can start and stop the flow of urine and do that a number of times a day, you can actually build up this PC muscle, and that will affect, especially in women, the intensity of the orgasm. A second thing that will increases this is rhythmic pelvic movements. And so when the pelvis is thrusting back and forth by the wife, rather than merely just lying there, this is associated with this as well. When muscles move in the body, there's actually a dynamic that's happening with the blood vessels. We all know the heart pumps blood, but actually there are valves along the blood vessels that open and close. These valves, for example, make it possible for us to stand erect without fainting. Without them, the gravitational effect of blood draining from the head would be a big problem. So when we move muscles, when we bend our arms, when we bend our fingers or our toes, well, in this case, the rocking of the hips, we actually are having a pumping action on the blood in the vessels around the genitals. A woman who will be responsive to her husband and what he's doing, both physically, verbally, emotionally, the more she's engaged completely, that also is associated with what are considered to be better orgasms. And then the last thing is her mental concentration or her imagination. Women, as I've said in other podcasts, are very often thinking about 100 different things. And so this concentrating, putting aside the things about which she's anxious, the plans she's making for tomorrow and whatever, and focusing, the more she's able to focus, the more that helps. Okay, so we're almost done with this podcast. I want to talk about men. orgasm in men, and then resolution, and then I have a few applications. Okay. With us, don't need to tell men who've been sexually active, orgasm comes on faster and it also lasts shorter. A man's orgasm may be only 3 to 5 seconds, where a woman's may be much longer than that. It is divided into phases. The first phase is called emission. Emission is described by Masters and Johnson as when orgasm is going to happen, it can't be stopped. They call it ejaculatory inevitability, or the point of no return. But actually, during this pre-ejaculation phase, semen is deposited near the top of the urethra. This is the tube in the penis, ready to be ejaculated. So you might say emission is lock and load. And when we get to that, to the semen being deposited there, that we're already on our way. The next phase is ejaculation itself, which is a series of rapid-fire contractions of the penile muscles and also the perianal area with involuntary pelvic thrusting. And again, this movement of the pelvis is squeezing and relaxing various blood vessels and tubes, etc. But it's possible to have an emission and ejaculation, without necessarily having the central nervous system and skeletal muscle involvement in an orgasm. So this affects the quality of an orgasm. The nerves causing the contractions within the genitals, within the penis, send pleasure signals to the brain, back to that limbic system I spoke of earlier. In the man, orgasm is, and in the woman as well, is a mind-body, entirely mind-body encompassing thing, and it's like a numbness. I don't know that numbness really captures it, but it's almost like having a seizure. There are 5 things that increase the physical intensity of orgasm in the male. The first is the volume of seminal fluid in the seminal vesicles. So waiting, not having a series of orgasms, but having time in between will allow the body to manufacture more seminal fluid, which larger volumes of seminal fluid relate to larger volumes of ejaculate. Secondly, slowing foreplay and excitement. A rapid orgasm does not have the same quality as one that is achieved more slowly and building. Number 3, as I said, with women, the mind is involved, so the imagination. And by imagination, I'm not talking about imagining someone else. What I mean by imagination is the process of creating images in your brain. And these images should be involved with your wife, as your wife should be involved with you. And this imagination can be greatly enhanced by being in the moment, by connecting with your wife, by watching and feeling her responses. Also, a voluntary contraction of the anal sphincter muscles during orgasm, because they're related, increases the effect. And also the force of thrusting, because these pelvic muscles are important to this whole thing. So a final word about the husband's orgasm. After ejaculation, the husband should continue to stimulate his wife so that she will either achieve orgasm or, and here's a news flash from the front. Women, while it is unusual for a man's orgasm is most often a single event. A woman's orgasm can be multiple. And for her greatest satisfaction, it is better if it is multiple. So the fact that the husband believes that a woman has reached a climax doesn't mean that she can't do it again. Just because he can't, necessarily, that doesn't mean that she can't. And so a husband should continue. And again, there's verbal and nonverbal communication during this whole thing. And he should be listening to his wife and listening to what she says and what she wants. I have some diagrams in the handout of the male versus the female orgasm. So the last phase is called resolution or afterglow or relaxation. During this phase, the husband shows tenderness to his wife with hugs, kisses, and caresses. This is, I think, one of the most important of the four phases to the wife. The husband demonstrates his love by his desire to continue in his wife's presence, expressing loving appreciation for her by his words and actions. Hugging and holding during this time are very important. Okay, so I have a few applications. Number one, intimacy. This physical intimacy is vital to a godly marriage, and husbands should take responsibility for it. Second, what I quoted in the last podcast from McCaney, touch her mind and heart before you touch her body. Number three, touch her mind, helping her to relax, reduce her stress and anxiety, and make her interested in you sexually. 4, stimulate her feelings, make her feel desired, sexy, and secure. 5, touch her gently and sensuously. Take your time. Activate her imagination. 6, think and tell her about your admiration for her entire body. 7, make sure she has the pleasure God intended in the ways He built her body. Encourage more than one climax. And 8, accept less than perfect sexual experiences, including your own failures. Well, that's it for now. This is physical intimacy number 2. In the next podcast, I want to do one more on the physical sex. And in that podcast, I want to talk about problems with sexual response and how to respond to them. Please pray with me, men. Thank you, Father, for creating us as sexual beings. Thank you, Lord, that with our positive charge, you've given us women a negative charge. Not that they're negative, but like the periodic table, that though we're volatile and explosive and caustic and toxic, that we can come together and find the stability and the oneness that we have also with you in Christ. Lord, I pray that you would forgive us our sins in these areas. Help us, Lord, to take responsibility and to lead our wives in bonding with us to the glory of Christ. Lord, I pray for the single men, any who may be listening to this, Lord, that you would keep them pure and that you would bring them a godly marriage and help them as you help us. Thank you for the power of the Holy Spirit, for our self-control, for the love and joy that you give us. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you for listening to the Basic Training Podcast, taught by Dr. Robert Forney. This podcast is available on Spotify and the Google and Apple Podcast apps, also on the Basic Training YouTube channel. If you want to contact us with any comments or questions, please email basictrainingpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening, and God bless.